The first sip of coffee was always the best. It was a ritual of quiet triumph for Michael, a bitter-edged reward after years of striving. He'd earned this. The gentle lap of water against the dock, the pine-scented air, the profound silence of his own lakefront cabin. It was more than a property. It was a sanctuary, a tangible piece of the peace he'd worked his entire life to secure. The tranquility was shattered not by a bird or a boat, but by a sound that was violently out of place. A frantic, hammering fist against the front door. Bam! 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 The force of it vibrated through the walls, sloshing coffee over the rim of his mug. His heart jumped into his throat. Who, or what, could that possibly be? Cautiously, he approached the door and opened it to find not one, but 3 members of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association standing on his porch. Their faces were set in masks of officious authority, but their eyes held a different, more unsettling glint: suspicion. "We need to come in," the lead member stated, his tone leaving no room for debate. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration. Before Michael could even form a question or a refusal, they were brushing past him, stepping uninvited into his living room. Their justification tumbled out in a rush of accusatory jargon. They had received reports. They said, suspicious activity. Vehicles that didn't belong. Their gazes darted around the room, not inspecting the property, but investigating him. The subtext was as loud as their knock. A black man alone in a luxury cabin was an anomaly they felt entitled to interrogate. They demanded to know what he was doing there. Their implication clear. They believed he was trespassing in his own home. What they failed to notice, in their zeal to uncover a crime, was the other man in the room, seated calmly in a leather armchair, partially obscured in the shadow corner, was a witness to their entire performative inquisition. He had been observing quietly, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. As the HOA member began to loudly reiterate their supposed right to enter and their duty to protect property values, the man in the chair set his mug down with a deliberate click. The sound cut through their bluster. He rose to his full height, his demeanor shifting from passive observer to the highest law enforcement officer in the state. "I think you need to explain to me exactly what you're doing," said State Attorney General Mark Daniels, his voice a low, controlled rumble that instantly drained the color from the HOA members' faces. "And you need to explain what statute, what bylaw, gives you the right to harass a homeowner and enter his property without notice, without cause, and certainly without a warrant." The air vanished from the room. The HOA's authority, which moments before it seemed so absolute, evaporated under the stern gaze of the Attorney General. Their suspicious activity was a business meeting between 2 respected professionals. The vehicle that didn't belong was the AG's official car. The confrontation that followed was a masterclass in humiliation. It wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet, legal, and utterly devastating. The AG meticulously dissected their actions, highlighting the blatant violation of privacy laws, the discriminatory profiling, and the staggering liability they had just incurred. The HOA members could only stammer, their bravado replaced by a dawning, horrifying realization of their mistake. They hadn't just embarrassed themselves. They had walked into a professional and public relations nightmare of catastrophic proportions, all within the 4 walls of the very sanctuary they had sought to violate. Michael said nothing. He simply watched, the steaming mug back in his hand, as the predators became the prey. The cabin was more than timber and stone to Marcus. It was a physical manifestation of a decades-long dream. Every weathered plank represented over time hours logged. Every window framing the serene lake view was a reminder of budgets carefully kept and vacations foregone. As a black man navigating a competitive corporate landscape, this retreat was his hard-won sanctuary, a place where the only demands came from the loons on the water and the whisper of the pines. It was his escape from the constant low-grade hum of urban stress and, though he seldom admitted it, from the subtle microaggressions of his daily life. This peace, however, was governed by the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. To Marcus, the HOA often felt less like a community board and more like a sovereign state with bizarre obsession with lawn length and mailbox aesthetics. He'd received terse, formal letters about his unapproved rustic-style shutters, though they were staying a permitted cedar tone, and a warning when his nephew's car, visiting for a weekend, was deemed to have occupied the guest spot for an excessive duration. Each interaction was a small paper cut, a reminder that his ownership was conditional and perpetually under observation. On this particular Saturday, the cabin felt perfect. Sunlight dappled the hardwood floors, and the air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and pine. Marcus was not alone. Seated across from him in a well-worn leather armchair was his friend of 20 years, Mark. Their history stretched back to college, a bond forged in lecture halls that had endured through career shifts, marriages, and now, the immense weight of Mark's public office. Today, Mark wasn't the state attorney general. He was just Mark, swapping stories and debating the merits of different fishing lures. They had carved out this rare, quiet afternoon to discuss a passion project, a mentorship initiative for young men of color in the city, a program they hoped to launch together. The conversation had drifted from community logistics to fond, foolish memories of their undergraduate years when a violent hammering at the door exploded the calm. Bam! 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 It wasn't a friendly knock. It was an assault on the silence. Marcus's heart jolted. His first, irrational thought was of trouble, an accident, an emergency. He opened the door to find the HOA president, a woman named Brenda known for her rigid adherence to the bylaws, flanked by two other board members. Their faces were set in grim, officious lines. "Mr. Evans," Brenda began, not waiting for a greeting. "We've had reports. Suspicious activity. Multiple vehicles coming and going at odd hours." Her eyes were already scanning the room behind him, looking for evidence of the transgression they were already convinced had occurred. "We need to perform a compliance inspection." Marcus was stunned. "An inspection? You can't be serious. There's no notice. This is..." But they were already moving past him, stepping over his threshold as if his protests were mere background noise. Their justification poured out vague concerns from neighbors, a need to protect property values, responsibility to ensure rules are being followed. The subtext was deafening. A black man hosting guests was, in their view, an inherently suspicious activity requiring investigation. They barely noticed the other man in the room, who had set his coffee down and watched the intrusion with a calm, analytical stillness. As Brenda began to question Marcus about his visitors and his reason for being here this weekend, the man in the armchair rose. The movement was deliberate and commanded attention. The room seemed to shrink around his presence. "I think you should stop right there," Mark said, his voice low but layered with an authority that instantly froze the three intruders. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let his identity fill the space. "Perhaps you'd like to explain to me, the Attorney General, precisely which statute or provision in your covenants grants you the right to enter a private residence without notice, without cause, and without a warrant based on nothing more than hearsay." The color drained from Brenda's face. The word Attorney General hung in the air, a lead weight of consequence. The petty power of the HOA bylaws evaporated in an instant, replaced by the terrifying, real-world specter of trespassing, unlawful entry, and a devastating lawsuit backed by the full weight of the state's top legal office. Their humiliation was not loud. It was a silent, profound unraveling. The individuals who had moments before been so eager to assert their authority could now only stammer and retreat, their mission of petty harassment collapsing into a nightmare of their own making. Marcus stood silently, the master of his house once more, as his friend, the highest lawman in the state, began to calmly, methodically, and utterly dismantle their every assumption. The heavy, urgent knocking was a violent intrusion, a sound that had no place in the serene soundscape of the lake. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a kind of pounding that suggested emergency, a demand for immediate submission. Marcus, his coffee halfway to his lips, froze. Before he could even push his chair back, the doorknob twisted and the door swung inward. Three members of the Lakeside Estates HOA board, President Brenda, Vice Chair Carl, and a newer member, Linda, stood on his threshold, but they didn't stay there. They crossed it, stepping into his home as if it were community property. The air, once filled with the easy comfort of old friendship, turned cold and charged. "Mr. Evans," Brenda announced, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth, "we have reason to believe you are in serious violation of the community covenants." Her eyes, sharp and assessing, were already performing a swift, invasive scan of the living area, darting past Marcus as if he were merely an obstruction. Marcus found his voice, a mix of shock and rising anger tightening his throat. What is the meaning of this? You can't just come in here. Get out. Now. Carl, a large man who always seemed to use his physical presence to intimidate, ignored him completely. We've had numerous complaints about unauthorized vehicles and short-term rental activity, he stated. His tone implying a verdict had already been reached. He took another step deeper into the cabin, peering down the hallway toward the bedrooms as if expecting to find a row of illicit tenants. I'm not renting anything. This is my home, Marcus insisted, his calm fracturing. These are my guests. You have no right. We have every right to protect the community's interests, Linda interjected, her voice shrill with self-importance. The rules are clear about frequent, unexplained visitors. It's our duty to investigate. The conversation was no longer about rules. It was a naked display of power and presumption. The subtext, ugly and familiar, coiled in the room. Marcus was a successful professional, but in that moment, he was reduced to a stereotype in their eyes. A rule breaker, a man to be suspicious of, an outsider in his own sanctuary. It was Carl who made the final, damning accusation. You can't just sneak people in and out and think no one will notice, he said, his words dripping with contempt. The phrase sneak people in hung in the air, toxic and unmistakable. It was the spark to Marcus's tinderbox of frustration. It wasn't about guests. It was about his guests. It was about him. And that's when the room went silent. The sound that broke the silence wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, deliberate creak of leather as the man in the armchair rose to his feet. He had been so still, so observant, that the HOA members had dismissed him as just another one of Marcus's unauthorized friends. Now, his movement commanded the entire room's focus. He stood to his full height, and his demeanor, once relaxed and conversational, shifted into something formidable. The easygoing friend was gone, replaced by the posture and piercing gaze of the state's chief law enforcement officer. I believe you've said quite enough, he said. His voice was low, measured, and carried an authority that instantly shriveled the HOA's bravado. It was a voice used in courtrooms in command, a voice that was accustomed to being obeyed. You will explain to me, right now, the legal basis for your warrantless entry into a private domicile. All three HOA members swiveled to face him, their faces blank with confusion that quickly curdled into dawning horror as they recognized the man standing before them. You will further explain, the Attorney General continued, taking a single deliberate step forward. What specific evidence, beyond bigoted assumptions, led you to believe you could accuse this homeowner of sneaking people into his own property? And you will do it knowing that I am the Attorney General, and that your explanation will determine whether we proceed with discussion about your staggering ignorance of property law, or a lawsuit for trespassing, harassment, and discriminatory targeting. The silence that followed was absolute. Brenda's mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping on air. Carl's intimidating posture deflated into stunned meekness. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly inverted and then vaporized. They had come to investigate a minor bylaw infraction and had instead barged headlong into a professional and legal nightmare of catastrophic proportions, all under the cold, disappointed gaze of the one man in the state they could not bully. Excuse me. The voice that cut through the tension was not loud, but it was a blade. It was calm, measured, and carried a weight of authority that instantly stilled the room. The three HOA members, who had been so focused on their self-righteous inquisition of Marcus, froze mid-sentence and turned toward the sound. Their eyes found the man rising from the leather armchair in the corner. He had been a silent silhouette, a detail they had dismissed in their zeal to confront Marcus. Now, as he stepped into the light, recognition dawned. Slowly for one, then in a sickening, simultaneous wave of horror for all three. The confident, accusatory masks they wore melted away, replaced by a gallery of panicked expressions. Jaws went slack, eyes widened in disbelief, and a deep, blotchy red flush crept up Brenda's neck. The state's Attorney General had been a silent witness to their entire unlawful performance. He didn't need to introduce himself. His presence was the introduction. He took a single step forward, not to threaten, but to claim the space, his gaze pinning each of them in turn. Do you believe you had the legal authority to enter this property without permission? he asked. The question was deceptively simple, delivered with the quiet precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It was not a query. It was a trap they had already sprung themselves. What followed was a spectacle of abject humiliation. Carl, who moments before had been peering down hallways, now looked at the floor as if searching for it to swallow him whole. Linda's mouth opened and closed, emitting only a faint, strangled squeak. Brenda, the president, attempted to rally, her voice trembling as she fumbled for the HOA bylaws, mumbling about community standards and right to inspect. The Attorney General listened, his expression one of cold, professional patience. He let them hang themselves with their own feeble justifications. When their stammering trailed into a terrified silence, he began to speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every word was layered with the immense gravity of his office. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his eyes never leaving theirs. "Your association's covenants are a civil contract. They are not the law of the land. The law of the land protects a citizen's right to peaceful enjoyment of their private property. It protects them from unlawful entry. It protects them from harassment. What you have done today is not a violation of your own rules. It is a violation of state law. You have committed trespass. You have attempted to intimidate a homeowner based on what appears to be, from my vantage point, a deeply prejudiced assumption." He let the word prejudice hang in the air, watching it land with the force of physical blow. They had come to accuse Marcus of sneaking people in. And in doing so, they had revealed their own bias. "You will leave this property immediately," he stated, the command absolute and final. "You will not contact Mr. Evans again except through formal written channels, copies of which will be sent to my office. Any further unannounced visits will be considered criminal trespass and will be dealt with accordingly." This time, there were no arguments, no claims of authority. There was only a frantic, silent scramble. They practically tripped over each other in their haste to retreat, to get back across the threshold they had so boldly violated moments before. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving a silence that was now profoundly different from the one they had shattered. Marcus stood in the center of the room, the adrenaline slowly receding. He looked at his friend, the Attorney General, who had just weaponized the law not with fury, but with devastating, incontestable fact. The hum of the refrigerator returned. Outside, a loon called on the lake. The sanctuary had been violated, but in its defense, a powerful line had been drawn in the sand. The law was now watching, and the watchers had been put on notice. The story didn't end with the HOA's humiliated retreat. The slamming of the cabin door was merely the opening note in a symphony of consequences that reverberated throughout lakeside estates. In a community that small, secrets were a currency spent quickly, and the story of the HOA's disastrous encounter was too explosive not to circulate. It began as a hushed, incredulous rumor. "Did you hear?" Brenda and the board barged into Marcus Evans's cabin. By the next evening, it was the only topic of conversation. The details, sharpened with each retelling, sparked outrage among a silent majority of homeowners who had long felt bullied by the board's overreach but had been too cowed to speak up. This wasn't a letter about unmowed grass. This was a fundamental violation. A petition began circulating, demanding the immediate resignation of the entire board. The backlash wasn't just about Marcus. It was a community realizing its own rights had been trampled alongside his. The incident's reach extended far beyond the neighborhood's wooded lanes. A brief, formal statement from the Attorney General's office confirmed it was reviewing the incident to determine if any state laws were violated. In the world of politics and law, this was a thunderclap disguised as bureaucratic language. It was a polite way of saying the HOA was now under the microscope of the highest legal authority in the state. The prospect of formal investigation into trespassing, harassment, and potential discriminatory practices sent a chill through the HOA's leadership, who were now consulting lawyers in a panic. Their petty authority had collided with the real thing, and the impact was catastrophic. For Marcus, the victory was profoundly bittersweet. Sitting on his dock the next morning, the peace felt different. The coffee tasted the same, the loons call as they always had. But the sanctuary's innocence was gone. The cabin's walls, which had always symbolized safety, now also reminded him that he had to be defended within them. He had been subjected to a glaring example of the bias he'd hoped to leave behind in the city. The assumption that his presence was inherently suspect, that his ownership was conditional. It was a wearying, familiar pain. Yet, there was a powerful, undeniable catharsis. For once, the truth had an unimpeachable witness. There would be no, they said. There would be no twisting of the narrative, no downplaying of the event as a misunderstanding. The highest lawman in the state had seen it all. The uninvited entry, the accusatory tones, the ugly implication behind the words, sneaking people in. The incident was now a matter of record, its truth etched in stone by the most credible observer imaginable. This story serves as a crucial, national reminder. Homeowners associations wield contractual power, not sovereign rule. They may govern paint colors and fence heights, but their authority ends at the threshold of a front door. The Fourth Amendment, the right to domestic privacy, and the basic laws against trespassing form a legal force field around every home, a force field that no HOA bylaw can penetrate. A homeowner's rights are not granted by a community covenant. They are guaranteed by the Constitution. And for those 3 HOA members, the consequences extended far beyond legal jeopardy or forced resignations. They were left with a personal, haunting humiliation. Their story became a cautionary tale, a modern fable about the perils of unchecked presumption. For years to come, they would be remembered as a people who, in a display of breathtaking arrogance, barged into the wrong cabin at the wrong time, and in doing so, handed their own power and a stunning victory to the very man they sought to intimidate. Their greatest fear had been an unauthorized guest. They ended up face to face with the one guest who could ensure they were never authorized to wield power again.